events. We implement outings where we can learn about science and the environment and expose the law students to that. Then do activities like this where you can find out what you can do to be a tool and help protect the environment through using legal means. If you're interested and you want to find out some more, we are hosting a reception back at the law school, so please come to the new law school. We're also hosting a conference in the spring, and you can find out more about that there. Thank you.
There is going to be a slight change in the program. Mayor Marc Morial is going to speak before Dr. Robert Cox. I'd like you to help me welcome Mayor Marc Morial.
Thank you very, very much, and to the sponsors, the Tulane Green Club, the Environmental Law Society, the Sierra Club New Orleans. I want to take this opportunity to thank you for including me in your program on this evening. I want to welcome Dr. Cox to New Orleans and tell you two things before making a presentation to him. Number one, on the local level, I want to say thanks to all of you for supporting some difficult things that we've tried to do. As you know, in the area of solid waste, in 1 year we've put in place a citywide recycling program. We've also, in the past month, got the City Council to go along with us, and they joined with us on a plan to dispose of New Orleans waste in a Subtitle D landfill for the first time in the history of the city. And why is that so significant? It's significant because the forces opposed to environmental sensibility really fought hard to try to stop us from going to Pecan Grove. If you know the issue, the council voted recently to allow us to dispose of New Orleans' waste in a Subtitle D landfill. It was the best thing to do fiscally, the best thing to do environmentally, and but for the lobbying efforts, but for the phone calls, but for the letters that many citizens in the community, the environmental community, sent in and came to the council, we would not have been successful. So tonight, I want to say a very special thanks to all of you for doing that. Also, I want to thank you for supporting our Office of Environmental Affairs. Sharon Harrington doesn't know this because I've never said it publicly, but my first exposure to her was when I served in the Louisiana State Senate. And she came before a committee that was studying environmental issues in her capacity as a lawyer for the Sierra Club Legal Defense Fund. And at that time, she made such an impressive presentation that her name, her face, and her abilities kind of stuck in my mind. And after we won the election in 1994, we were looking for people to head this new Office of Environmental Affairs. I personally recruited her, and she joined our administration. In that time, that Office of Environmental Affairs has expanded. It secured grants. And what we've tried to do with that office is be a partner with the environmental movement in this community. For too long, the government of this city was at odds with those things that were environmentally sensible. We've tried to change that. We've tried to say that a positive, progressive government ought to be an ally, ought to be a partner with the environmental community to do sensible things in this community, and we're going to continue to do those kinds of things. Just a couple of comments about what's going on the national level. I know that all of you know that environmental issues have been under assault at the federal level, that the EPA has been targeted for funding cutbacks, that many things that you and I believe very strongly in are under attack from certain members of Congress. I can't tell you that the only way to ensure that that retrenchment does not occur is because of folks like you, because of people beyond this room, because of the needs for a grassroots advocacy movement in this nation. The people in Washington, no matter how well-intentioned on either side of the aisle, can't fight this battle without grassroots support. With people raising the issues, with people speaking out. The city of New Orleans faces dramatic cutbacks on many, many things that are important to us. To me, the basic tragedy of what is happening in Washington is that a judgment is being made that it is more important to give large tax cuts to a handful of Americans than it is to balance the budget or than it is to have balanced priorities at the federal level. I'm going to be fighting, and I'm going to be working, and I urge you to keep fighting and working for the things that are important to you at the federal level. We have got to forestall this retrenchment on environmental issues, because I think we've begun to make progress. The American people are much more aware of environmental issues than ever before, and we cannot allow the clock to be turned back. So I urge you to engage in that battle, engage in that fight, to lead that grassroots movement. Lastly, on behalf of all of the citizens of this city, I am very pleased to bestow upon Dr. Robert Cox the title of Honorary Citizen. His work at the Sierra Club, away from his work at Chapel Hill, has been so important in the Sierra Club's progress. He's got a tough job on his hands. We've got to support him with our voices. We've also got to support him with our money, because the Sierra Club relies on citizens to support its efforts, and in many respects, they are on the front line fighting against interests with so much money and so many resources. So Dr. Cox, there's a key here. Doesn't open the treasury, but it's a key. It's a key to our city, and we're very pleased to be able to bestow this title on you tonight.
Good evening and welcome. My name is Aaron Allen. I'm the editor of the Environmental Forum for Tulane University Green Club. Now is a pivotal time in our history. The threat to environmental legislation in our Congress is unprecedented. It's unbelievable. Here on this campus and in southern Louisiana, we can play an important role in influencing the path that Washington takes. In an initiative to develop cognizance of the threat to the environment, the Sierra Club New Orleans Group, the Tulane University Green Club, and the Tulane Environmental Law Society welcome Dr. Robbie Cox, president of the Sierra Club. The Sierra Club is America's oldest environmental organization, founded in 1892. It has over 500,000 members throughout the U.S. and Canada, and with representative groups in every single state. They also represent over 400 grassroots organizations across North America. Dr. Cox was elected president in 1994 and is currently on a 2-year leave of absence from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. He is a professor there in communication studies. His position with the Sierra Club is totally voluntary. He receives absolutely no payment. When he's not fighting the battle for our environment, he's leading treks to the Himalayas of Tibet. Now I'd like to present to you Dr. Robbie Cox, and he's going to present something to you on the war on the environment. But most importantly, he's going to tell you what you can do to become empowered and to get involved. Please help me welcome Dr. Robbie Cox.
Well, I wanted to thank Mayor Morial, and I hope Sharon will take back my just profound thanks for that warm welcome and wonderful statement. I must say that after being in the very toxic atmosphere of our nation's capital, that it is a delight not only to be in New Orleans, but to be made an honorary citizen of the city. I must say also to the mayor that we were there with him when he first ran for the Senate, and endorsed him and look forward to a continuing relationship with your office and the mayor as we fight some of our common battles against very common enemies. Thank you to the Tulane University Law Society, the Green Club, and the New Orleans group of the Sierra Club for hosting this event and making all of these arrangements. I very much appreciate and feel honored to be asked to be on this campus with you tonight. I wanted to speak on the general title, The War on the Environment, and what individual students and members of the community can do to resist this momentous event in American history. This truly is a watershed moment in American environmental history. And it is something of an irony that having just celebrated the 25th anniversary of Earth Day, out of respect for the planet, that we now find ourselves literally this week and next week poised to make decisions to roll back 25 years of environmental and public health law in this nation. The irony is furthered when we look at the success of many of the environmental laws that so many citizens struggled for over the years. Our air is slowly getting cleaner. Our rivers don't catch on fire any longer. The bald eagle is back. Just recently, I saw a study that the Endangered Species Act has been so successful that of the original species endangered when the act was first passed, 60% have now been stabilized or are recovering. Just last week, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration completed an 8-year study of the chemical residues found in the tissues of oysters and mussels along our coastlines, and found that there is now the beginning of a decline in toxic contamination in our waterways. And finally, last week, we found that the results of last year in New York State showed a 12% drop in toxic emissions into the air. And yet, the logic of and I must say, the right wing that has captured the Republican Party in this country believes that, well, the laws have worked, so let's abolish them. It's as though saying that I'm well, so close the hospitals. Now, lest you think this is an exaggeration, I want you to review for a moment with me what your area representatives and others in this Congress have been doing since January of 1995, when the 104th Congress came into power. And it's time to name names as well. Representatives Billy Tozan, Representative Hayes, and Bob Livingston have been among those who helped launch this war on the environment and are currently among its most boisterous cheerleaders. January, week 1 of the new Congress, the leaders in the Senate announced the top 10 laws on their hit list. 8 of them were the nation's basic environmental laws: the Clean Water Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act, the Endangered Species Act, Superfund, wetlands, the Delaney Clause. That's that obscure little clause that keeps pesticides out of your processed food, like applesauce, baby food, and such. In the House of Representatives, we had Speaker Newt Gingrich's so-called contract with America. When we read the fine print just before the Congress began its demolition derby, we discovered that though the word environment had never been mentioned during the campaign in 1994, we now find that buried in Section 8 of the contract was a systematic blueprint to gut the basic authority of the Federal Food and Drug Administration, the Environmental Protection Agency, and other national agencies that are responsible for our health and our basic environment. We found that by the time the first 100 days had ended, the House under Gingrich had passed laws that would cripple the ability of those agencies to uphold basic public health and environment standards. And not only that, in the radical flip-flop of our basic constitutional rights for private property, passed a bill that would literally pay polluters not to pollute our wetlands or to kill endangered species. And that if the taxpayer couldn't fork up enough money to pay industry to obey the law, then those laws could not be obeyed. More recently, we have begun to see an attack upon the basic statutes themselves, openly when they have dared, and also through a stealth campaign through the budget process, that arcane, esoteric process that most of us simply have our eyes glazed over when it is discussed. So let me give you a quick primer in what's happening to your environment and the communities where you live and work. Let's start with the core statutes themselves that have been targeted thus far. First, the Clean Water Act. One of the environmental laws that we know that has succeeded more than any other. Passed in 1972, it set strict standards and timetables for bringing our waterways, lakes, rivers, and streams up to a basic public health standard. so that we no longer had to get inoculation shots when we would go swimming. They had to be, in the phrase of the law, fishable and swimmable, on the assumption that if they could sustain those activities, they met a reasonable but basic standard of public.
Lapping on our shore, one earth so green and round, who could ask for more? And because it's sorry, so it's a two. One more. Oh. That's what growing up being British is all about, learning to be embarrassed and survive. Anyway, and because I love you, I'll give it one more try. My rainbow-colored race, it's too soon to die.
Let's give Paul a hand. Is everyone
Essential resource that sustains not only the fishing industry, tourism, but the source of safe drinking water for most of our communities, serves as filters for floods, and under conditions such as we've been witnessing in the last hurricane season, a vital buffer for many low-lying areas. Mr. Faircloth's bill would also redefine what a wetlands is so that 60% of them are removed from protection. Third, the Endangered Species Act, an act that, as I've said, has been enormously successful and has been enormously popular with the American people. Last year, the symbol of America, the bald eagle, was taken off the endangered list after it made a successful comeback. That law is being rewritten in this Congress and was scheduled for what is called markup today. That means the final language being agreed to in committee. And let me tell you who's doing this. The new chairman of the House Natural Resources Committee, the new Congress retitled the committee. They dropped the word natural. It's now simply called the House Resources Committee, which gives you a clue. Is Don Young, a former fur trapper and hard drinker from Alaska, who has appointed the fiercest critic of the Endangered Species Act, Richard Pombo of California, to author the rewrite of the Endangered Species Act. That act essentially strips it of its most important element of protection. If you want to preserve a threatened or endangered species, one of the most logical things you would do would be to ensure that the trees in which it nests, the rivers in which it spawns, or the forest in which it reproduces is preserved intact so that the basic habitat in which that species lives is protected and the species given some chance to recover. Pombo's bill will eliminate the insistence that we protect habitat. That's as though you say that you're willing to preserve a species of fish, but you can drain the lake, and that's not a taking of that species under the Act. Well, there's more. Let me mention briefly the Clean Air Act. Certainly one of the most vital elements of every American's right to a safe and healthy environment to breathe the air. On the first week of the new Congress in January, the majority whip under Newt Gingrich, Tom DeLay of Texas, personally introduced 4 bills that gut the essence of the Clean Air Act. Bill number 1 eliminates the protection against toxic airborne emissions. Bill number 2 eliminates the protection against depletion of the ozone. Bill number 3 eliminates the provisions for acid rain. And Bill number 4 eliminates the community's right to know what's being discharged into the air where we live and work. Finally, number 5, Superfund. In the last Congress, we had reached an historic compromise to radically overhaul a law that almost everyone agreed was not working, was enormously slow in cleaning up areas, and where most of the money went to the attorneys. Environmentalists came together with corporations, with insurance companies, and we had the basis of a reasonable compromise. That has now gone out the window, and in the 104th Congress, we're currently witnessing 1/3 slash in the basic funds for cleanup, a rollback of what's called retroactive liability. That means, in plain English, that if we had just now discovered the mess at Love Canal created by Hooker Chemical, we could not hold them financially responsible for cleaning it up. You may recall from your classes that Hooker Chemical was the one that essentially dumped, buried, and put out of sight thousands of barrels of toxic chemicals just below the ground, turned over the title to that ground to the local elementary school and charged them $1 for the title and skipped town. They were later discovered and held responsible for that action. Under the proposed Superfund law, we could no longer hold such companies responsible if they polluted and skipped before the Superfund Act itself was passed in 1980 and 88. Those are the core statutes that are now being stripped of their essential protections. But there's another strategy that the GOP is trying out, and that is a more stealth campaign, behind the scenes, back door. And I think they're doing this for a very shrewd reason. They've learned their rhetorical lessons well from the failure of an earlier Republican administration, James Watt, who was Interior Secretary under Ronald Reagan. James Watt was rather open about his plans to destroy the American wilderness. He testified before the U.S. Congress, and folks, I'm not making this up, this is a fact, as Brother Woodball would say. He said, "Why save wilderness for future generations when the end of the world is at hand? Wilderness should be open for development, mining, and such now for the enjoyment of the immediate generation." This Congress understood that kind of open attack upon valued American environmental protection, protecting our last remaining wild places and the quality of life of the communities where we live, would not fly. Mr. Watt's initiatives were rejected out of hand by the American public and by a Congress that was willing to stand on principle. This crowd thinks it has to go through the back door to accomplish the same agenda. So here's what they've been doing through the arcane budget process. First out of the gate was something called the rescission bill. This is a lesson in budget acronyms and terminology, more than you'll ever want to know. The rescission bill essentially takes back money that had already been appropriated in the past Congress. Well, that was fine. They pulled back some of the money, but they also slipped in subtly a little rider, it's called, that was entitled salvage logging. Now, on the surface, this sounds fine. They said, listen, we have a lot of restrictions on our ancient forests. You can't cut as many trees now as you used to, but you can salvage trees that are dead or dying or already down. And on the surface, as I said, it seems to make some sense, unless you happen to believe that the regeneration of native forests requires that kind of dead and dying tree to remain within the forest. But when you read the fine print, you discovered that they defined what a salvage logging operation is by saying any dead or dying tree, or any tree that's susceptible to disease. This becomes a problem because trees are made out of wood, and that's a problem. And any other associated tree in the forest, which essentially means all live and healthy trees are now subject to a logging operation. Second, they said, forget about all of the environmental laws that regulate ancient forests. The practice of forestry, can't cut too close to streams for salmon or breeding and so forth, are now suspended for the purpose of salvage logging, which means logging any live tree in the forest. All environmental laws are now set aside. And third, you can no longer as a citizen go into courts and ask that the logging companies obey the law. The right of appeal had been suspended. The president signed that rescission package with that rider attached to it. And I must say, one of the proudest moments that I had as president of the Sierra Club was in leading what we call a 21 chainsaw salute to President Clinton the day he signed the rescission bill for such a sacrifice of principle to special interests in this country. Second, the EPA Appropriations Bill, the Environmental Protection Agency. The House of Representatives slashed its budget by 1/3, as the mayor said, but they did something else. They attached 17 controversial riders to what was ordinarily a budget process, the appropriations bill. Those riders eliminated the ability of the EPA to enforce critical provisions of the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, wetlands, the ability to regulate discharge of sewage into waterways and streams. It then went to the Senate. The Senate also slashed the budget by 23%, took out a couple of the riders, but left in many of these dreadful policy directives, including such things as forbidding the EPA from issuing a new public health standard that regulates how much arsenic you can dump into the water from which you draw your drinking water from, how much radioactivity, how much cryptosporidium can be present in your drinking water source. That was the bacterial disease that killed an estimated 500 people in the city of Milwaukee when there was an outbreak of cryptosporidium in the waterway. Now you would think this really wasn't intended and someone could catch it. Well, there were a couple of efforts to try this. For example, a new study had just appeared that residents living near oil refineries experience an overall mortality rate greater than the rest of the population from cancer and all sources of diseases. On July 28th, the EPA announced that it intended to promulgate a new standard for public health for areas around oil refineries, and it set new restrictions for the discharge of toxics from such refineries. Not to miss a bet, the GOP added a provision that would ban the EPA from carrying out that new public health standard. One senator tried to blow the whistle on this. Senator Max Baucus of Montana rose on the floor of the Senate when it came to his body and proposed, at least let's allow the EPA to continue to enforce a law even though its authority to do so has been suspended under one of these riders, if the public health and the safety of the community were at stake. The majority GOP turned down even that modest effort to preserve the basic integrity of America's Environmental Protection Agency. Finally, the stealth attack upon our public lands in the last wild places of the North American planet, at least within the reach of the Congress. We are witnessing an effort to open America's truly last wilderness, the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge on the coastal plain of the North Slope of Alaska. This is often called America's Serengeti Plain, where the thousands of porcupine caribou herds migrate out of Canada and calve, give birth to their young on the coastal plain, feed, and when they're strong enough, begin the migratory march back to their home grounds in Canada. The GOP said that we're short about $1.3 billion in balancing the budget. We think we can make up that difference by selling leases to oil companies to drill the biological heart of the Alaskan Arctic National Wildlife Refuge and make up that difference. That has become the symbolic test for the Clinton administration for the budget battles in the coming weeks and in November. And the president, to his credit, has announced that he is willing to veto the entire, what is called, reconciliation package, which rolls all the budget bills into one, which is the strategy of the Congress, and send it to the president for his signature. That he's willing to veto the entire reconciliation package if they open the symbol of America's last wilderness and to drill the Arctic. We shall see. There are also individual efforts to sell off America's wildlands in the West, to transfer a title of public lands to states for sale to private developers. The front line of that battle is in the state of Utah, which has some of the last remaining truly wild, scenic, and unique areas in the lower 48 states, some 5.7 million acres of truly wild lands which still exist out of the reach of the Holiday Inn chain, McDonald's, and your local gas station. The Utah delegation has proposed what it calls a Utah Wilderness Bill that releases virtually all of that land for development, declares 1.8 million wilderness, and then guts the 1964 Wilderness Act that says Wilderness means wild. You can't build roads in it, power plants, and has provided exemption for all of the above development activities within the boundaries of what would be declared as wilderness. And I must say that there's a table outside, and Chris has been distributing alerts on what you can do as students to write Senator Bennett Johnston, who will be a pivotal vote in the final Senate vote on Utah and on other areas such as the Arctic. The last travesty on public lands is an archaic bill called the 1872 Mining Act. It says simply that if you're a prospector, you stumble across an unclaimed piece of America's public land in the West, you can stake a claim for as little as $2.50 an acre. And if you find any gold or uranium or other valuable minerals underneath the ground, well, you can just mine it for free. Billions of dollars worth of assets that belong to the public are being given away every year and have been since 1872. This Congress has thus far refused to reform that act, a simple way to make up $1.3 billion, by the way, and save the Arctic. Now, was this the mandate of the 1964 revolution that we hear about? The mandate for the new Congress? Is this what the public really wants? Well, you would think so if you listen to the GOP rhetorical claims. After all, we want to get big government off our back, we want less regulations, and we heard those claims in the campaign, but we didn't understand that what they meant was that we need to get public health regulations off our back, regulations that preserve wild places off our back. I think this Congress is willing to risk the classic Greek sin of hubris, perhaps, of overreaching. Because I must say, the public didn't agree to this contract to dismantle 25 years of environmental regulations. Let me give you some of the evidence. During the campaign season itself last year, the Atlanta Constitution reported, a study by Times Mirror, that when asked, the American people said, the Endangered Species Act is fine like it is, or it doesn't go far enough in protecting species, 75%. When asked if wetlands protections were about right, too strict, or didn't go far enough, 92% of Americans said protection of our wetlands is either just about right or not strict enough. Today, I read a study by the Louisiana Department of Natural Resources that found 80% of the voters in Billy Tozan's district say that protection of wetlands do not go far enough or about right. I think the congressman needs to come back home once in a while and talk with his constituents. By the way, I said that to the congressman on TV today, Saul Alinsky once said, in organizing, you have to remember to have a little bit of fun now and then. So we decided this morning to challenge Billy Tozan to a public debate and to explain why he's taking so much money from corporate lobbyists who are trying to gut the Clean Water Act, why he's voting for bills that block the EPA from enforcing public health standards and so forth, and suggested that Mr. Tozan might want to step off the floor of the House of Representatives, where he's privileged and subject to no challenges, certainly from the Sierra Club, that he might want to meet me in a public place somewhere and answer a couple questions I had for him. So we'll see. I do believe that this crowd is overreaching. Yesterday, Speaker Gingrich postponed the markup of the budget reconciliation bill in order to give moderates in his own party an opportunity to vent their frustration with the leadership over its gutting of the environment under the cloak of the budget process. GOP advisors are now warning the party that they are threatened with loss in the elections in 1996 if they continue to move in a direction in which the public perceives that they are rolling back environmental laws, food safety laws, and becoming too cozy with special interests. Margaret Criss writes in the National Journal that Republican analysts now fear that the public perceives the Republicans to be responsible for the rollback of basic environmental protection in America. Now, what has produced the beginning of this possible turnaround, and what can you do as students or members of your community? Well, for its part, the Sierra Club has launched what we call a Stop the War on the Environment campaign. And we believe the only way you can do that is the way that Mayor Morial just suggested a few minutes ago. You get outside of the Beltway in Washington, D.C., and you mount a citizen-based grassroots campaign in your hometowns and in the home districts of members of Congress like Billy Tozan, Bob Livingston, Representative Hayes of Louisiana. And you sound the alarm. When they vote to gut the Clean Water Act, you call that into account. You write letters to the local newspaper, you call local talk shows, you attend high visibility meetings, you attend their district meetings and town hall meetings, and you ask them to explain themselves in public. And you ask in public of others, why is the congressman doing this? And the reason for this is to return to the public debate what has been hidden from the public, that every American has a right in this country to a safe and a healthy environment and an enduring legacy of wildness and wildlife for future generations. To return the debate to public health, to the safety and well-being of communities in which we live and work and play, and as Native Americans remind us where we bury our elders. It is the right of future generations to breathe clean air, to drink water that is safe, and to an earth that sustains life and the communities of life that are part of creation. But each one of us must give voice to this vision and to these values. And I cannot underscore the importance of what you can do. I think that there is a game in this country whose object is to convince you that you can't make a difference, that government is so mystified that you can't figure out how it works. And so, why ask? Sit back, enjoy, and as long as the commodities are delivered, you can have a good life. The one with the most toys at the end, and so forth. But I'm here to tell you that it ain't that difficult. And these guys are scared to death that you can figure it out and demystify this process. We know because we've begun to turn around some of these freshman class GOP Republican members, particularly those that were elected in marginal districts only by a few hundred or thousand votes, and in areas that used to send strong environmental leaders to the Congress. We've written letters, we've sounded the alarm, we've asked them in public town hall meetings, why are you voting to sell the earth? And we've kept after them. One of the oldest maxims of the Sierra Club for grassroots organizing is simply constant pressure, constantly applied. And we're beginning to see, one after the other, Republicans breaking with their leadership. Now, this is a courageous act, because this is a top-down, centralized, highly disciplined party effort, where to go against the speaker on a party vote is to risk censure when you bring your district's bills into committee. In January, I can count on my hand only 6 Republicans in the House that would vote for the environment. By June, we had 51 Republicans in the House breaking with Newt Gingrich to stand up for a strong Now, I didn't do that as president of the Sierra Club, and directors like Roy Henderson in the back didn't do that as a director in San Francisco. People in every community of this land did that by combining their voices and speaking out and demanding accountability. And if we do that, I'm convinced that even in the face of this moment and of this threat and of this crowd, that we can reclaim our communities and reclaim the earth, and you're part of it. And it starts this week, and it starts now, and it starts in New Orleans. And thank you for having me here with you.
set up for you to use, and we'll let the panelists get started right now.
Well, that's a hard act to follow. But, I want to thank Robert Cox for his presentation, and I want to share with you my equally grave concern about the current situation in Washington. I do want to underscore one point that Mr. Cox made, and that is about the power of your own voice with respect to what politicians do in Washington and locally. I was one of the people who called our two council persons at large, as well as Suzanne Terrell in my own district, with respect to the issue of what to do with the solid waste in this city, which has been for a long time being put in a unsatisfactory, basically unregulated dump near New Orleans. And instead to send the solid waste to a regulated and approved facility in Mississippi. And at first the council was almost unanimously against this proposal, in part because they were afraid it might add $1 a month to the solid waste disposal fee. But as a result of the phone calls and action that was taken by local people, in fact the council voted, I think it was 7-1 or some extraordinary vote in favor of this procedure. This is what has been happening in Washington with respect to many of these Republican congresspersons there. They've been feeling the heat from home. And therefore, if you are concerned about what's happening there, it's your obligation to undertake the same type of acts that so many of us here have done in New Orleans, and that is to let your congresspeople know how you feel about these matters. Now, it's a very interesting situation that's developed, because in fact, politically, there was, as Robert Cox has pointed out, a general perception on the part of many Americans, and this is what the last election was about, that there is perhaps too much regulation in the federal government, and anybody who owns a business or runs a university is aware that things, to some extent, have gotten out of hand. So that there was a receptivity to some changes, and including some changes that might have been beneficial even in the environmental area. But that's not what's taking place. What's taking place is something much more like what Robert Cox has described, which is a frontal assault on environmental regulations, which most Americans admire. So what we have is a very different activity than the Republicans were sent to Congress to achieve, in my view, with respect to environmental issues. And when Republican senators and congressmen returned to Utah in recent months to discuss with their constituents this bill to gut much of the wilderness areas there and to make them open to exploitation, they were astounded to discover that a very high percentage of the people attending the meetings, plus about 70% of the constituents, as revealed in polls, were opposed to this measure. They had assumed, the politicians in fact, that their citizens would support this. Now the fact that the politicians in that state continue to support these acts to gut the wilderness status of so much important land there indicates an undermining of the democratic process. Because if these people are not actually representing their own constituents, we have to ask who they are representing, and we know they're the interests of large extraction corporations, which are extremely problematic in the West. Now, I want to make one point which hasn't been touched on here, but this has to do with the overkill rhetoric of some contemporary politics. We hear a number of Republican politicians, as well as members of the so-called Sahara Club and other extremely conservative organizations which are trying to roll back environmental bills. They speak of something like eco-fascism, and they often cite the takings doctrines of the Fifth Amendment of the United States Constitution as support of their idea that what environmentalists are doing is really taking land in an illegal manner away from the citizens in order to support things like grasshoppers, snails, fish, and other things that live in swamps, etc., and wetlands, and that this is an act of fascism. But this is a completely false representation of what's going on. Land holdings in this country have never been absolute. They've always been subject to legal restriction. Zoning laws of all sorts have long been in place. And so what we have here under the idea of eco-fascism is an ideological cloak to conceal what is really going on, which are, for the most part, large extractive and other corporations, seeing to it that very important environmental laws, which have had a tremendously good, beneficial impact on our nation's resources, wetlands, and wild places, are to be dismantled. and not for the sake of the well-being of the majority of the citizens, but for the well-being of a relatively small number of very powerful corporations. So it's up to you to make your voice as citizens known in this matter, to see through the ideological nonsense that's being brought forth, and simultaneously, I'll close with this point, to keep clear about when, in fact, there are good ideas that come from the Republican Congress. There are many good things about what's called free market environmentalism. There are many good things that this would contribute. But what we see in this Congress is not really about free market environmentalism. It's about something that has a much darker, problematic look to it. And this we should very much resist. So I want to thank Robert Cox for being here tonight.
Well, I feel like a pacifist at Scarlett O'Hara's house in April of 1861. I think I'm here for purposes of diversity. Biodiversity is good. What about intellectual or ideological diversity? We're hearing the toxin sound tonight, a war toxin. People who hold ideas that I agree with, who do not represent big corporations, are the enemy, apparently. And this doesn't mean they're against the environment, I don't think. I ask people all the time, how do you feel about the environment? And 80% of the people I ask will say that they're either highly concerned or very concerned about it. People are concerned about it. I'm concerned about it. But that does not translate into policy agreement on all these issues. I'm sure everybody here would agree. I'm a little bit disturbed, and I think we all are, at what one political scientist has called the Europeanization of American politics. The segmentation of the American people into groups divided in every conceivable way. The demonization of people who happen to differ. And this isn't done just by Sierra Club. This is done by all sides. And I think that we need to maybe tone down the rhetoric. I understand the reason for symbols and for mobilization. I understand some of the needs that we have environmentally. But I'm not sure government is the best way to go. I was glad to hear Professor Zimmerman give a nod at least to free market environmentalism. I'm a little bit more libertarian, I guess, than the average bear. By the way, speaking of diversity, are there any Republicans here? I'm glad there's a few, you know. We don't want this thing to go all one way, because that's where fascism comes in, you know. Fascism is when you get everybody into the same ideological frame of mind and then put everybody else in a concentration camp. That's fascism. I don't think any of us want that. None of us here tonight want that. Now, let me tell you how I feel about this. There's not any sane person on earth who doesn't want a good environment. The issue is not whether or not we're going to have a good environment. It is about power and wealth and the redistribution thereof. I think probably we can agree on that. The question is, how good an environment? Who pays for it? How much? Whose way of life is changed by the regulations? And make no mistake, every government regulation is a redistribution of wealth and power. Maybe a small one, maybe a big one. Cumulatively, they're big ones. Now, I think that government, as I said before, may not be the best way to accomplish some of these goals of environmental protection. I think what happens is that we turn the environment sometimes into a political commodity, and it's just hawked about in the political market, just like any other so-called cause. And I don't think that's what we want to do with a subject that is as serious and as freighted with consequence as the environment is. But this talk of war and battle and enemy, sometimes I feel the same way, embattled in the corner. I want to bring up 2 or 3 quick points, factual sorts of things. Professor Cox has said that the endangered species legislation has done wonders in preserving endangered species. I wonder if our causal theory there is very good. Almost all the money that's been spent under the Environmental Protection Act has been poured into about 10 species. I don't think the Environmental Species Act per se saved anything. I do think that people who got mobilized did have a big impact. And, but I don't think that we ought to establish a cause-and-effect relationship here on the basis of the evidence that I've seen. I don't know. Maybe it's like a war where you can just declare victory when you want to and get out. But I'm just not so sure that many of the things that were done by government have actually, they've received more credit maybe than they've got coming. I was interested in the Love Canal thing. Hooker did pollute the land. They did turn the land over to local government, not to another private agency. And at the time that they turned it over, they did warn them that there were hazardous wastes there, which was ignored by the local government. Now, I don't know that Hooker did what I would want them to do, or that they went as far as they ought to have gone. But it isn't just because somebody represents a corporation, or it isn't if you represent a corporation, you're necessarily out to destroy the environment. I don't agree with much of the environmental rhetoric. I'm not affiliated with any large corporation except Tulane, which of course is hardly a special interest. Another thing, landholding and the right of eminent domain and the limitations on property rights, certainly they're not absolute. Certainly I don't want to see them absolute. But the constitutional point is, if you're going to take the use of the land, then pay the people like the Constitution says for it. Don't pretend that you haven't interfered with their right to use the property. Take it if need be, but compensate them justly. As I say, I feel a little bit like a boll weevil in a cotton patch, but I'm really glad to have been invited to come tonight and to be allowed to be a little bit diverse at least, and I hope you are also, and I appreciate listening to Dr. Cox. Thank you. These guys fight dirty.
No, I'm right here. I'm fine. Thank you. Thank you, Brother Pendergraft, Brother Zimmerman, Brother Cox. I'd like to make a couple of observations, the first of which is one that I'm sure you all would want to make if you were here at the mic, and that is, it is to be sure that every government environmentally protective regulation reallocates wealth and distributes power. But so does every industrial discharge that is unregulated, because it dumps power. We're trying to correct an imbalance of unpermitted tyranny. And in that light, the regulation is a balancing mechanism. The second observation I make is that with regard to private property, every environmentalist in this country can live with exactly what the Constitution requires for compensating takings on private property. It is the Congress that is the radical. It is the Congress that's trying to change the Constitution. That's what this legislation is about. Thirdly, as to Brother Cox, I'd like to make these observations. First, he did not have the time to tell you about the Contract with America's Top 10 list. This is their list, not our rhetoric. This is their list. 9 of the hit list, which was called, in their words, a hit list, were environmental laws. Do you know what the 10th was? The truth in lending laws. Does that speak volumes? I don't think there's any disagreement among any of the panelists with what Dr. Cox was saying is happening in Washington. We may disagree on whether it is the degree to which it's inappropriate. But I wanted to explore with you in the few minutes I have here why it's happening. And I'd like to begin with why it isn't. Because the isn'ts are full of isms, like conservatism and federalism and capitalisms. And they ain't the game. In my 25 years now of experience in environmental issues, I have come to be convinced that the single greatest step we could take in protecting the environment is simply stopping subsidizing its destruction. And it goes far beyond the free minerals in the public lands, although that's a great example. We are selling federal timber at half the cost. We are selling federal grass at a third of the cost. We are selling federal irrigation water in California for a tenth of the cost. We have the oil depletion allowance. We have second home mortgage deductions, your ranchette in the Rockies. We have flood insurance for every condo across Florida, and so it goes. And you know what these things all have in common? Numero uno. They cost about $200 billion a year of your money collectively. Dos. They're called free market. Tres. They're terribly environmentally destructive. And cuatro, they're not on the table in DC. They're nowhere to be found. You know where the axe is falling? EPA, the Endangered Species Act, and Amtrak. That's it. That's it. This isn't a thing to do with fiscal conservatism, nor does it have anything to do with federalism. The laws are getting thrown back at the states with no money to implement them, with no authority to implement them. They're sent back in handcuffs. They're sent back in chains. Nor does it have anything to do with free market incentives. I would be delighted with free market incentives for carbon emissions, for reducing nutrient loadings in the dead zone that's now 6,000 square miles wide and growing at the mouth of the Mississippi. I'd be delighted with tax incentives for landowners who husbanded their lands for natural resources. None of those are proposed by the contract people. They don't give a damn about the market. It isn't about any of those isms. So what's it about? Well, what I suggest to you it's about are pretty elemental things. One is politics, and the other is fear. For politics, you don't have to look any farther than our own congressional delegation, and let's start with Congressman Livingston. Budget Bob. Budget Bob runs the House Appropriations Committee, and you may know that he opened up the hearings this year with a flamboyant display of a meat cleaver he brought in. And a knife. And he said, if the knife doesn't work, the meat cleaver will. He says, we're not only going to cut important projects, we're not only going to cut necessary projects, we're going to cut to the bone. The only thing left is the absolutely essential, quote, close quote. The same week, he sent $20 million to the Pearl River Navigation Canal for a port city at Bogalusa, Louisiana. The absolutely essential. And we have Senator Johnson, who was known in Washington as the senator from Big Oil, who explained our incursion in the Gulf War as having three good reasons, and they were O-I-L. And who was the chief proponent for opening up the Arctic Range to oil and gas development. And then we have, of course, the famous duo, Batman and Robin, Tozan and Hayes, who of 450 plus House of Representatives congressmen are number 1 and number 4 in political action committee contributions. And that tells you exactly why all the data that Robbie Cox offers about the way their constituents feel don't matter, because that isn't where the money comes from. And that's what's wrong. And that's what's fundamentally wrong. And that's why belonging to the Sierra Club is perhaps less important than belonging to Common Cause. Because I don't think we can cure this sucker anymore by trying to put our votes against their money. That's just, it's just too the myth of Sisyphus, you know, we can't roll that thing up the hill, whatever that myth was. Instead, yeah, maybe you can do it, I can't do it. It seems to me that until the way we fund and elect public officials in this country has changed, the environment's doomed, and that's where we ought to be putting our horses. The other part is the fear part, and we all know it, we all see it around us, we all see the deterioration of our myths, right? Where are we going to get a job? Can we walk out at night? Everything's going to hell, and who's to blame? Well, if you read the Times-Picayune yesterday about the Amtrak derailment, you found the answer. A guy wrote in and said, look at those nuts that took up the track. They're just like the environmentalists. End of letter. To him it was self-evident, right? I mean, there's an enormous amount of scapegoating on. I'll just leave you with this one other remembrance. Renee Haskins, who was probably more responsible than any person on earth for putting the wolves back into Yellowstone, was at a recent hearing in Yellowstone, and she wrote the following experience. As she sat in the audience before her turn to speak, so she wasn't known, a rancher turned to her and said, God damn it, he said, you know, it's really the New York Jews that are throwing these wolves down our throats. And I thought, my God, 2 scapegoats in one. I thought, that's amazing. And yet, that's part of what we're dealing with. And that's what makes it so hard. I just want to exit the conversation with these observations. All worms turn. This will pass. And when it does, I don't think we're going to be satisfied with just laws next time. We're going to be putting this stuff in the Constitution of the United States. And in fact, some of us are already beginning to work on that. So our day will come. Hang in there. Thank you. The first question was spilling water on Dr. Pendergrass accidental or intentional? The answer is... I have to think about that. Thank you.
At least it was clean water. Actually, I'd like to address the panel question or the concept of risk assessment. As a new idea for driving regulatory or agency actions. I'd like to open it up to Dr. Cox all the way down. Your comments on whether this new idea of risk assessment is a foundation or agency action. Thank you.
Well, Carol Brown of the EPA acknowledges that risk is a very useful analytical tool, and in fact, the EPA already and quite regularly makes use of risk assessments where they feel it's appropriate. The important difference is that under existing EPA practice and under existing statutes, risk must be subordinate to a public health criterion as the basic premise. I talked with Dr. Pete Andrews at the University of North Carolina last week, who chaired a national effort to assess EPA and to develop recommendations. He's a very firm believer in the rational use of risk assessment, but he acknowledges that in the current debate in the Congress that risk has become politicized and functions as an excuse not to implement standards rather than to rationally arbitrate among competing choices. So I think we're going to have to wait until we get out of this poisoned atmosphere before we can return to a reasoned discussion of what are the appropriate uses of risk.
I think Robbie Cox said it, but I'd like to say it a slightly different way. The chief proponent of risk assessment in the U.S. Congress is Bennett Johnson. If you ring his bell at all, that's the bell to ring. Secondly, it is absolutely valid when you write Bennett to say, it's a great tool for determining where you're going to spend your research, where you're going to spend your enforcement, for allocating your resources. Obviously, you pay attention to the highest risk. But it is absolute fantasy to think that risk assessment is going to tell you that an industrial discharge should reach 0.0013 parts per million of dioxin. That's fantasy. And the farther you get into how that fantasy is developed, with people eating imaginary fish heads and breathing at the fence line for 24 hours a day for 19 years, you will see that the assumptions on which these numbers are based are like the Wizard of Oz. You know, behind that curtain, there's just nothing but guesswork. Thank you.
Most of my work is actually in risk assessment.
Let's go.
And let me tell you that a risk is a threat to something you value. So if your values differ, then your assessment of risk differs. And I would beg to differ on some of the threats. I just think maybe there are threats that are larger sometimes than particular environmental threats. I would agree with about a lot of the methodology. A lot of it is pretty bad, and this is just an example of politicization of something. You have to have some kind of rational basis to make a decision on whether the basis is really rational or not. So you go through a great deal of effort to come up with a so-called objective assessment of risk, which is probably a goal that nobody's ever going to find.
Would you allow me to do this? You are lucky enough to have in your audience tonight the expert on risk assessment in this region of the country, former director of the National Institute of Health, now the head of Tulane's Center for Environmental Studies, Dr. John McLaughlin. I don't know, John, whether you have any comment you'd like to make on this, but at least you might want to be recognized here for the expertise that you have, which will certainly shut my mouth. Thank you.
This is directed to Dr. Pendergraft. Louisiana has the highest level of toxic emissions in the country. And halfway since 1989, that level has gone down because of the work of the Department of Environmental Quality, which was established, well, you can beg to differ with that or not, but do you believe that corporations are going to wholeheartedly accept pollution abatement technology, spending the cost for that without government regulation? Don't you think that DEQ played a significant role and that there is an important role for government to play? Or are you, do you believe that it's corporate goodwill will essentially allow companies to pay for the environmental remediation that we need in the state?
I believe we never depend on goodwill. We depend on self-interest. And it depends, when we say pollution, that covers a multitude of sins. Most pollution, most waste is actually a cost to a company. So if they can figure out how to dispose of it more cheaply, they will, or to recycle it or whatever is the cheapest thing for them to do. No, I don't think that a lot of change would be made without some legislation. I think there has to be carrots and sticks. I agree with Professor Haug about use of market-like sticks, however, a lot of times, because they combine the benefits of both. Especially when you're talking about emissions and waste. There's a role for government. I'm not an anarchist, but I don't depend on the goodwill of the government either.
Can I add something to that too? I think it is important to keep in mind the following fact. Probably the worst polluter in the entire country is the federal government. If you look at what has happened to the military installations in this country since the end of World War II, it's just a shocking thing to discover the extent to which significant portions of this country are severely poisoned, not only by radioactivity, but by the toxins associated with munitions productions and so on. the military was tremendously careless in its practices. And now we have a situation out at Hanford, Washington, where this university has been doing a little bit of work trying to figure out how to effect a remediation job on the radioactivity that's been left by the production of fissionable materials there. And the fact is that no one has the foggiest idea of what to do. So it is important to keep in mind that we ought not to rely on large structures in Washington naively to think that is going to be enough to take care of things. This is why it's important for every person to take seriously his or her role as a citizen and to act within our local communities in concert with other individuals and groups to see to it that activities that are taking place here by government, corporation, and other institutions, and by private citizens are carried on in a way that's, how shall I put it, consistent with environmental well-being. So just keep that in mind. There's no panacea that comes from Washington. Washington causes a lot of the problems. On the other hand, Washington has produced some important solutions, which we ought not naively give up.
If we have no more questions now, we will proceed over to the law school, where we have excellent. Thank you. First of all, I wanted to thank you, Dr. Cox, for coming tonight. It's a pleasure to have you here. You generally are in a league of some of the men, the original founders of the American country, and some of the people who early on spoke for some of the true feelings and represented the genuine and enlightened people who originally founded the country. I think you belong in a group of those guys, and now with like the politicians that we had today, or on that league, but I was let me see what we got.
Hey, you're doing great so far.
You really hit the issues hard tonight, and you didn't give us any visions of we like to think of. Oh, you didn't sugarcoat any of your words, and you really were sincere, and you really hit the issues hard. And I was wondering when it comes to someone like Al Gore, who ran with Bill Clinton on a campaign saying that he was going to be for the environment, and when the issues come into Congress now, how can someone such as himself, or even other spokespersons on the same plane as him, how can their voice be silenced so much when someone like him, who was, he wrote his book, The Earth in Balance, and just wondering where does he stand today, and is he going to boost his participation in trying to stop the tyranny?
That's a question a lot of people have asked. I must say, I'm convinced, and I've met with the Vice President a number of times, that he is a man of integrity, he's intelligent, he is the Vice President, and he is enormously constrained in his public statements about the environment. He is, however, a very fierce infighter inside the councils in the Clinton administration. But frankly, under the existing management structure in the White House, not just Clinton, but the modern White House, the Vice President has much less influence than the Chief of Staff has. And if you want to know who has the real influence in deciding what the President will veto, what he will not, and what he will spend his political chips on, it's Leon Panetta, who I think was more responsible than any other member of the Clinton cabinet for influencing the President to sign the rescission bill and to let the logging issue go through. And the rumor was that he said, let's see how loudly the environmentalists scream before I decide whether to spend the political chips of the President on public lands issues, again, as opposed to pollution issues. And that's why I think it's important, as the panel has just said, that if we want accountability vice president needs that kind of political constituent power to add leverage to his own voice inside the debates within the White House. I think he's clearly going to run in the year 2000 for president. Gore is.
Would you allow a friendly amendment, which is this? To be fair to the Clinton administration, in times it's very hard. Recently, you have seen very strong initiatives and statements that didn't have to be done by Hazel O'Leary at the Department of Energy, by Alice Rifkin at the Office of Management and Budget, going toe-to-toe with some really nasty congressional committees, proposing initiatives that were far-ranging and equitable, that had social justice written all over them, that were right. And so, although Gore is somewhat neutered by his position and perhaps by his presidential aspirations, there are other members of this administration who are coming to the plate, and I think they deserve that additional recognition.
I agree.
Oh, I know that.
Yeah, I agree with that, but let me add one other thing to it. I think the president himself deserves some credit in terms of executive orders and what he can do under his own discretion. He did, after all, sign the executive order for environmental justice. Now, it's an open question how much that's being implemented and how quickly. And he's made a number of other important appointments and executive order decisions, but he's gone about as far as he can go without confronting congressional power.
Yeah, I'd like to ask a question. Many of you who had on know me, I was a leader in the Sierra Club at one time, locally and nationally. And I came to the realization, and I was wondering if you would have a similar opinion, that we are missing out on a large political force that's really working against us rather than for us, namely the churches and synagogues. One of the things that I found in my religion, I'm Jewish, is that the rabbis have understated or ignored the very strong connection between Judaism and environmentalism. And I know there's an extremely strong connection between the Muslim religion and environmentalism. It's older and more developed in some sense than the Jewish one. And I don't know what the connections are in other religions, but what I'm wondering is, how can we tap into that? And my feeling, having worked with the Sierra Club for most of the decade, is that we can get a large number we can get turnouts like this, which represent a large number, but a tiny fraction of the population, very interested. But there's 100 or 1,000 times that many people who go to church and don't hear anything from their ministers or rabbis. And what do you think, what can we do about that? And I'll just say that I've tried to start something in my own way about it, but within Judaism, but I think the problem is much bigger than what just the Jews can do anyway.
Well, can I address this? I teach a course in environmental philosophy. We usually have a segment on Judaism and Christianity and so on, what they can contribute. And I think that there is a movement afoot in rabbinical schools and in seminaries and in Catholic seminaries and so on, which is very much concerned to redefine the relation between humanity and nature, which has been very problematic in the last 400 years or so, ever since the Protestant Reformation. This is what Dr. Cox is pointing out when James Watt, who was Secretary of the Interior under Ronald Reagan, he claimed that the reason that we should develop as rapidly as possible all the remaining untapped resources in the United States was that Jesus Christ is probably going to come back within a generation, and we didn't want to have not developed or invested our talents. He was actually referring to a passage in the New Testament that many Christians would be familiar with. But this is a pretty startling thing for many people to hear, and I think Dr. Cox is right. This is why a lot of this action is going on in the budget hearings in order to avoid this kind of assertion. What happened in the Protestant Reformation was that nature was completely stripped of any inherent value. The whole idea that there was anything redeemable about nature apart from divine intervention was gotten rid of. The Protestant Reformation basically opened up the natural world to total exploitation on the part of human beings. This means that nothing other than human beings has any value whatsoever, except insofar as it can be useful to the development of human life as the activity required by the Creator in connection with the processes of redemption. Now, this is a very radical doctrine, which is really not held by any other people in the history of the entire planet. So this type of thinking has affected to a large extent the political scene. Now, it's not only conservatives who hold this. Marxists have the same doctrine, basically. Nature is nothing but stuff to be used collectively, just as in private enterprises to be used for private purposes. But nature for both capitalists and communists is nothing but raw material, which has no inherent value. Now, how can we rethink this? Well, one place to rethink it does involve beginning with the churches, beginning with a new reappraisal of the Hebrew Bible, the New Testament, with respect to their assessment of the meaning and significance of creation. Creation is a manifestation of God. It's not merely stuff to be used however human beings choose, but it has human beings have a role, something like that, of stewards to take care of this planet as well as to use it in ways that enhance human life. And if the churches in this country ever really got on board in this area, and there is some movement in this direction, there would be substantial echoes in how things are done in this country. But this remains to be seen whether it will happen.
I'd like to just add an empirical note there. One of the things I ask in my research, which is into environmental attitudes, I give people statements and ask them to react to them. And one of them says that there is no such thing as a human mandate or a mandate, natural or God-given, to humans to dominate the earth. And people's reactions to that correlate very highly to their attitudes about the environment. People who are inclined not to be environmentalists normally will disagree with that statement. They think there is a mandate for humans to dominate the earth. And environmentalists are very much inclined to deny it. That's whatever you make of that, that's sort of what the data shows. But environmental issues, dealing as they do with our very fundamental relationships to the creation or to nature, to one another, has to be influenced by religious points of view or moral or ethical points of view for those who reject religion. That's as it should be. There's no way, I don't think, that we could have a movement about something of such ultimate value without bringing religious or quasi-religious ideas into it.
Those are two remarkably learned answers to a question that may have had a practical side as well, which was, what can we do to make the links? And so let me just deal with the nuts and bolts aspect of this in two ways. There are ecumenical groups here in South Louisiana who are very aggressive in pushing a multi-religious environmental agenda. The buzzword is stewardship, and it's being conducted through Catholic dioceses, through Episcopal and other churches. I don't know whether the Jewish church synagogues are tied in, but I feel certain they are. The leader of this is on the national council of this effort. His name is Rob Borman. He's located out of Houma, and he also happens to be the president of the Coalition to Restore Coastal Louisiana, which is the natural resources group of this state. So the church, in fact, your Sierra Club Lafayette chapter, the past president is Harold Scheffler. His wife has that whole church community tied into environmental issues west of the base and west of the Atchafalaya. So it's moving. It's a train you can catch. The other is, the missing train to me is right here in the city. The one powerful religious force in this city are the black churches in particular. And you have beaucoup issues in common that you haven't exploited. Billboards, green space, housing, a whole bunch of core issues. I wish Sharon Harrington, the mayor's assistant, were still here. She'd give you a shopping list. That's the bridge you need to make. I would really get together with the black churches and move this agenda and bring them into your convocations as
Well,
well.
why should the black churches be a part of the
Good point.
movement that has been exclusively
It's good.
intellectual? And it sounds good, but I am a person who believes that intellect is much, much too important to be sequestered in academia.
Good.
It needs to be on the alleys and the bars. Right down
It's
there.
good.
And as I look at you four white guys,
Yeah, right.
expounding a risk assessment. I know
Yeah.
people who aren't going to be assessed for a risk or anything. I just had to say it.
I'm glad you did. And let me tell you that a week ago, we have a very large and active Black Law Students Association at Tulane. Mary Penny was with me, and they asked us to come in and make a presentation on the curriculum. The very first words out of my mouth were, here come 3 white people to talk with you about the environmental agenda. You know, what's that got to do with anything? And what I then attempted to say was, it's got a lot to do with the quality of their lives, with African American communities getting beat up by industrial discharges. But if you correlate where the billboards are and what they advertise, which is cigarettes and liquor, and where they're located, which is on top of the 9th Ward and the rest in this city, you begin to get some feeling of what kind of racial effect environmental degradation is having. And that's something that I think whites and blacks could work on.
But yes, it's definitely the discourse, because we have a situation that you would consider.
Please.
Consider a society that refuses to educate people. Consider a society that refuses to put any resources, reallocation of resources into education, medical care, and think of, with the advent of integration, people are allowed to move out of the core city, and we'll call it the core city. We don't like the word urban.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
We'll find another word to use for it. Let me go back to 1940, World War II, which was the advent of a lot of the social change that was unplanned in this country. Go right up to the Great Migration North. You probably heard of it. 5 million African Americans went west and north. And at the same time, you had the returning veterans from World War II. And they endured some of the hardships that have been lost in the shuffle of the historical cards of this country and in Korea. And then here comes Dr. King, and people say, we're going to be free, or else. Then you get the speculators come into this mix and say, well, here's an opportunity, it's going to happen. Supreme Court did Brown versus Board of Education. No one gave that about the Supreme Court until they made that decision in 1954. And folks began to move out, putting pressure of redevelopment into some of those pristine places. And then there was other folks in the core city, like I grew up in the neighborhoods, communities, everyone had to be there because you couldn't live any other place. With that was a very, very important cultural aspect of the American agenda, the American face, etc. Because of the advent of integration, folks moved out. They wanted, you can't blame them for wanting a better life for themselves and their families. And what was left behind was just underclass. That's growing at tremendous leaps and bounds, with the advent on top of them of the negativity of society: drugs, liquor, denial, toxic waste. It's always been an environmental issue. And you got institutions lending institutions refuse to give them money. And they said, I won't go on, but it's a scenario that you need to take into consideration when you make decisions today, as things are really coming down on us. And we're really going to have to look in the long term, not short-term answers. We need to look further than I see us looking here this evening. I hear nothing innovative. I hear much of the same old, same old. And we certainly don't need other organizations, but we need organizations to merge and make an agreement that there's common ground here that we need to ascend to, because we sure in the hell don't fall together. Don't ascend.
Let me just say that I think what you said is one of the most important things you said tonight. Secondly, if that's not an invitation and an answer to your question, I don't know what is. Your ball.
Just add a comment to what Bill Redding just said. As Bill knows, the environmental justice grassroots movement is the most rapidly growing sector of the American environmental movement. And it is difficult, and the The initial meetings and interactions and confrontations and searches for common ground is often an anguished and conflictive process, and yet it is happening. And those initiatives are being constructed, and they're being constructed out of experiences and an experienced trust. And that's the only way that it's going to last or be sustained. I'm proud that Bill Redding is a staff member for the Sierra Club, and the work of other Sierra Club groups in Louisiana, and I see Bob Hastings sitting over there as well, the current chapter, and the alliances that are being built, frankly, all over the Southwest, the South, the Northeast, the West Coast, and many other parts of this country, with communities of color that are often the most vulnerable communities, and we're beginning to articulate common grounds of interest and identity. And it's going to be a long, and it's going to be a difficult process at times because of the history of distrust in this country that's an earned, well-earned history. I want to thank you for what you suggested. Some exciting things are happening. Conservation biologists in California tell me that they now prefer no longer to speak of biodiversity loss because few people understand biodiversity, and they, as scientists, are finding themselves referring to the destruction of creation in order to capture the rich symbolic of the communities of life that are imperiled and a corresponding ethic of responsibility or obligation in what some of the churches are calling stewardship. The other exciting thing that is happening is on a more global basis. I had an extraordinary privilege 2 weeks ago to be invited by the Ecumenical Patriarch of Constantinople to join a group of world religious leaders in Istanbul to explore whether there were still existing common grounds among the world's religions: Buddhism, Hinduism, Zoroastrianism, Islam, Judaism, and Eastern Orthodox and Western Christian churches. And it was an extraordinary revelation of the reclaiming of, in some cases, minority traditions or latent traditions that had been passed over in a sense of re-envisioning the earth as creation, and that for the first time beginning to use in their sermons charges that pollution is a sin against the creation. And I think that's significantly a very powerful articulation. Thank you.
I'm sure we could carry this on all night, given the impetus to do so. However, we are going to stop here. We will move to the Tulane University Law School, where we have a reception with lots of great food and drink. We hope you all come and join us.